A blind Omega saved the Alpha King's heir from drowning. Now his entire pack guards her door. The cottage smelled of pine resin and decay, two scents that had become so familiar to Nora Whitlock that she no longer registered them as separate things, just the general atmosphere of survival, of existing in a space that wasn't quite home but wasn't quite prison either. She moved through the small kitchen with the practiced precision of someone who had counted every step 1,000 times, her fingers trailing along the worn wooden counter, 23 inches to the cabinet, 18 inches to the sink, 31 inches to the stove. Numbers had become her sight, measurements her map through a world that had gone dark 5 years ago, when fire had consumed not just her parents' house, but her entire understanding of what her life was supposed to be. The morning routine was always the same, unchanging in its monotony, which was both comfort and cage. She woke at dawn not because she could see the light, but because her body had learned the rhythm of Mrs. Aldwich's need, the elderly woman's breathing shifting from the deep pulls of sleep to the shallow gasps that meant pain was dragging her back to consciousness. Nora would rise, dress in clothes she'd memorized by texture, soft cotton shirt, worn jeans with a small tear on the left knee that she'd never bothered to mend because what did it matter if no one saw her anyway? And make her way to the kitchen to prepare tea with honey, the way Mrs. Aldwich liked it, sweet enough to mask the bitterness of the heart medication that was doing less and less with each passing week. Mrs. Aldwich was dying, that much had been clear for months now, and Nora carried the guilt of her own selfishness like a stone in her chest because she didn't want the old woman to die. Not out of love, though there was affection there, genuine and warm, but out of terror for what came after. When Mrs. Aldwich passed, and the doctors had said it could be weeks now, maybe a month if they were lucky, Nora would have nowhere to go. No one who needed a blind housekeeper who couldn't drive to town for supplies or read the mail or do any of the 1,000 things that made a person useful rather than a burden. She heard the creak of floorboards from the bedroom. Mrs. Aldwich was awake, and Nora moved with the tea, counting steps again, 47 from kitchen to bedroom door, her hand finding the doorknob with the ease of repetition. The old woman's voice was paper-thin, fragile as moth wings. "You're too good to me, child. Too good for this lonely place." Nora smiled because Mrs. Aldwich expected it, because kindness demanded it, even though the words felt like a noose tightening, a reminder that this lonely place was all she had, that goodness was just another word for trapped. The rest of the morning passed in the usual tasks, helping Mrs. Aldwich to the bathroom, changing the bedding, preparing a breakfast that would mostly go uneaten because appetite was another thing the old woman's failing heart had stolen from her. Nora worked in silence, her world reduced to texture and temperature and sound, the rasp of sheets, the warmth of sunlight through the window that she couldn't see but could feel on her skin, the distant rush of the creek that ran behind the property, water over stones, constant and indifferent. It was Tuesday, which meant Miss Voss would visit, the social worker who came once a month to check on Mrs. Aldwich's condition and sign whatever papers the state required to continue the home care stipend that paid Nora's meager salary. Nora had never liked Miss Voss, though she couldn't articulate why, just a visceral discomfort that settled in her stomach whenever the woman entered the cottage, her voice too smooth, her questions too pointed, the way she seemed to watch Nora, even though Nora couldn't see her watching, just felt it, an itch between her shoulder blades that never quite went away until the woman left. Miss Voss arrived at 11, her knock sharp and perfunctory, and Nora opened the door, stepping aside to let her enter. The woman smelled of expensive perfume and something else, something cold that Nora couldn't name, like winter air or metal, clinical and distant. "Nora," Miss Voss said, her tone friendly in a way that felt practiced rather than genuine, "you're looking well. Country air agrees with you." It was the same greeting every month, as scripted as everything else, and Nora murmured the expected response. "Thank you, you're kind, would you like tea?" All the social niceties that kept the interaction smooth. They sat in the small living room, Miss Voss reviewing paperwork that she read aloud in a bored monotone, questions about Mrs. Aldwich's medications, her eating habits, her mental state, and Nora answered each one with the careful honesty of someone who knew that the wrong answer could mean losing everything. When the official business was done, Miss Voss's attention shifted, and Nora felt it, like a change in air pressure, the way the woman leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "You've been here, 4 years now? Isolated, 20 miles from town, no family, no friends visiting. Don't you ever feel trapped, Nora?" The question was innocent on its surface, concern from a social worker for a vulnerable young woman, but underneath it, Nora heard something else, a probing that felt less like care and more like assessment, as if Miss Voss were testing for weakness, looking for cracks. "I'm safe here," Nora said carefully, which was true in the most literal sense. She had shelter and food and purpose, even if that purpose was just serving as companion to a dying woman. "Mrs. Aldwich has been kind to me. I'm grateful." Miss Voss made a small humming sound, neither agreement nor disagreement, just acknowledgement. Gratitude is important, but so is knowing your place, knowing when you're safe because you're where nothing can find you. The words hung in the air, strange and weighted with meaning that Nora couldn't quite grasp, and before she could ask for clarification, Miss Voss was standing, gathering her papers, her tone shifting back to professional brightness. "Well, everything seems in order. I'll see you next month, dear. Take care of yourself." After she left, Nora sat alone in the living room for a long time, that peculiar discomfort still crawling under her skin, the sense that she'd just been warned about something without understanding what. She shook it off eventually, because what else could she do, and returned to her routine, to the only life she had, measured in steps and textures, and the slow countdown to the day when Mrs. Aldwich's breathing would stop, and Nora would be cast back into a world that had no use for a blind woman with no skills beyond counting steps in the dark. That evening, after Mrs. Aldwich had fallen into restless sleep, Nora stood by the kitchen window, her hand pressed against the glass, feeling the cold seep through, autumn turning toward winter. She couldn't see the forest beyond, couldn't see the stars that Mrs. Aldwich sometimes described to her, but she could feel the vastness of it, the isolation that was both protection and prison. Somewhere in the back of her mind, in dreams she barely remembered upon waking, she ran through those forests, feet pounding earth, wind and hair that streamed behind her like gold, and her eyes, her dream eyes, could see everything, every tree, every shadow, every possibility. But dreams were just another cruelty, showing her a life that could never be hers. And when she woke each morning to darkness, the loss felt fresh all over again. She heard Mrs. Aldwich cough, a wet, rattling sound that meant the fluid was building in her lungs again, and Nora turned from the window, from useless dreams and impossible longings, and went to do what she was good for, to be present, to be useful, to exist in the spaces between other people's needs and her own suffocating desire for something more, something she couldn't even name, because she'd forgotten what it felt like to want anything beyond simple survival. 3 days after Miss Voss's visit, Mrs. Aldwich's breathing had worsened to the point where Nora could hear the struggle from the kitchen, each inhale a battle that the old woman was slowly losing. The doctor had come the previous afternoon, his prognosis delivered in the careful, gentle tones reserved for inevitable tragedies. Weeks at most, perhaps only days. Make her comfortable, there's nothing more we can do. Nora had nodded, thanked him, and felt the floor of her future crumble beneath her feet, leading nothing but free fall and the certainty that she had perhaps a month before she'd be standing on some street corner with nothing but the clothes on her back and a disability that made her unemployable in any practical sense. The firewood supply was running low, and Mrs. Aldwich needed warmth more than anything now, her body unable to regulate temperature, alternating between chills that made her shake and fevers that left the sheets soaked. Nora had made the walk to the creek before, following the path she'd memorized through careful repetition. 214 steps from the back door to where the trees thinned and the sound of water grew loud enough to guide her the rest of the way. She carried the canvas bag, moved with her walking stick extended, counting silently, letting the October air fill her lungs with the scent of decomposing leaves and pine and the particular crispness that meant winter was coming, ready or not. The creek wasn't large, more a stream really, but it ran fast this time of year, fed by mountain runoff, and the sound of it was almost deafening as Nora knelt by the bank, feeling along the rocks for pieces of driftwood that had dried enough to burn. Her fingers worked methodically, testing weight and moisture, selecting pieces and placing them in her bag. And she was so focused on the task that she almost didn't hear it. The small splash, the gasping sound that was wrong, too high-pitched, too desperate. The sound of something struggling against water that didn't care about struggle or survival. Nora's head snapped up, her sightless eyes turning toward the sound. And for a moment she hesitated, because she knew, logically, rationally, that a blind woman wading into fast-moving water was suicide, that she could drown just as easily as whatever was out there drowning now. But the sound came again, smaller this time, weaker, and something in her chest tightened because she knew that sound, had heard it in her own throat 5 years ago when fire had consumed everything and she'd been choking on smoke and fear and the certainty of death. She dropped the bag, kicked off her shoes, and stepped into the creek, the cold hitting her like a physical blow, water soaking through her jeans and stealing the breath from her lungs. She moved carefully, feeling with her feet for the rocks beneath, using the sound as her guide. 3 feet out, 5 feet, the current pulling at her legs, trying to sweep her downstream. Her hands stretched in front of her, fingers spread wide, searching, searching. And then she felt it, something solid and small and moving weakly against her palm. She grabbed, pulled, felt the weight of a child. Couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old based on the size, and wrapped her arms around the small body, turning back toward the shore that she prayed was still behind her, because direction was meaningless in water, in darkness, when panic was screaming through every nerve. She stumbled, nearly went under, her foot slipping on algae-covered stone, but she held on, dragged herself and the child forward through sheer stubborn refusal to let another life end when she could prevent it. And then her knees hit the bank, and she was crawling up onto solid ground, the child clutched against her chest. The boy, she could tell now it was a boy, was coughing, choking up water, and Nora rolled him onto his side, her hands moving over his small back, feeling for injuries, checking that he was breathing, really breathing, not just gasping. He was so cold, shaking violently, and she pulled off her jacket, wrapped it around him, even though she was soaked and freezing herself, because he was smaller, more vulnerable, and children die from exposure faster than adults. She knew that much. "You're okay," she said, her voice shaking almost as badly as her hands. "You're safe now. I've got you." The boy whimpered, small, frightened sounds, and Nora held him closer, trying to share what little warmth her body had left. She needed to get him to the cottage, needed to get them both dry and warm. But before she could move, before she could even process what to do next, she heard them. Footsteps, multiple sets, heavy and fast, coming through the forest with purpose and speed that spoke of training, of coordination. Nora's breath caught because she was alone, vulnerable, holding someone else's child. And she had no way to defend herself, no way to run, couldn't even see who was coming, or how many.
The footsteps stopped. She could feel the presence of bodies surrounding her, at least 4, maybe more. And then a voice cut through the sound of the creak, deep enough that she felt it in her chest, a tone that expected obedience without question. "Step away from him." Nora's arms tightened instinctively around the boy, protective, even though she had no idea who he was or why armed men were chasing through the forest after him. "He almost drowned," she said, hating how weak her voice sounded, how the cold made her teeth chatter. "He needs medical attention. He needs to get warm. He needs—" The growling started then, low and rumbling, coming from multiple
Viple throats at once, and Nora's mind stuttered because that wasn't human, couldn't be human, was the sound of animals, predators, and her prey instincts screamed at her to run, even though running was pointless when you couldn't see where you were going. The boy in her arms made a small sound, not fear, but something else, recognition maybe. And then another voice, younger, spoke quickly in a language Nora didn't understand, and the growling stopped as abruptly as it had started. Footsteps again, just one set this time, approaching slowly, and Nora forced herself to stay still, to not show the terror that was singing through her blood. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him. The way the air seemed to thicken, to press against her skin like a physical weight. And when he spoke again, his voice was closer, controlled, but with something underneath, something barely leashed. "You saved my son." The words didn't make sense at first. Son? This man's son? And Nora's confusion must have shown on her face, because he continued, his tone shifting slightly, losing some of that command, and gaining something that might have been wonder or shock or both. "You're blind. You went into the water blind, and you could have drowned yourself." It wasn't a question, but Nora answered anyway, because what else could she do? "He's just a child. Anyone would have." "Not anyone," the man interrupted, and then she felt him kneel beside her, felt the heat of his body even through the cold and wet, close enough that she could smell him, pine and something wild, like winter storms and dark forests and things that shouldn't exist. "Let me see you." His hand touched her shoulder, just a simple touch, checking for injury maybe, or asserting authority, she didn't know. But the moment his skin met hers, even through the wet fabric of her shirt, everything else ceased to matter. The cold vanished, the sound of the creak faded to nothing. Her awareness narrowed to a single point of contact that burned like fire but didn't hurt, that sent electricity racing through her nervous system and made her gasp, made her whole body jerk with the force of it. She heard him make a sound, something between a growl and a curse, and his hand tightened on her shoulder, not painfully, but with intensity, with need. And she could feel him shaking now too, but not from cold, from something else entirely. The boy between them made a questioning sound, and the man released her abruptly, as if the touch had burned him too. And Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the echo of that contact singing through her blood, like recognition, like coming home, like every stupid romantic notion she'd ever dismissed as fantasy. And none of it made any sense, because you didn't fall in love with a stranger's touch, didn't feel your soul reach for someone you'd never met. Except, apparently you did. Apparently that was possible. And Nora didn't know whether to laugh or cry or run screaming into the forest. "Come with me," the man said, his voice rougher now, less controlled. "Please." The please sounded like it cost him something, like a man unused to asking rather than commanding. And Nora should have refused, should have insisted on returning to the cottage, to Mrs. Aldwych, to her safe, predictable, suffocating life. But the boy was still shivering, needed help she couldn't provide alone. And beneath that reasonable justification was the truth she didn't want to examine, that she wanted to go with him, wanted to follow that voice wherever it led, and that terrified her more than anything else that had happened in the last 5 impossible minutes.
The vehicle was larger than any car Nora had been in, high off the ground, requiring someone to help lift her into the seat because her legs were shaking too badly to manage the step. Someone had wrapped her in a coat that smelled like the man, like pine and winter storms. And the boy, Phoenix, she'd heard them call him, had refused to let go of her hand, his small fingers gripping hers with the determination of someone much older. The drive was short, maybe 10 minutes, but long enough for Nora to realize that she'd made a monumentally stupid decision, that she was in a vehicle with armed strangers going to an unknown location, and no one, not even Mrs. Aldwych, knew where she was. The compound, because that was the only word that fit, the scale of what she could sense when they arrived, was overwhelming in a way that made Nora's carefully constructed navigation systems completely useless. Too many sounds, footsteps and voices and doors opening and closing, too
many scents layered on top of each other until she couldn't distinguish individual elements. Too many presences. Dozens of heartbeats that she shouldn't have been able to hear, but somehow could. A distant percussion that filled the air like distant thunder. Hands guided her, not the man, but someone else, a woman with a kind voice who introduced herself as Tessa and led Nora through what felt like endless corridors, explaining each turn, each step, trying to help her build a mental map that Nora knew would take days to memorize. They entered a room that smelled of antiseptic and herbs, medical facility, and Nora was helped into a chair while Tessa checked her temperature, her pulse, asked questions about injuries, and Nora answered mechanically, "No, nothing hurts, just cold. I just need to get warm." An older man entered, his footsteps careful and measured, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular cadence of someone educated, precise. "I'm Dr. Jonah Cartwright. I need to examine you for hypothermia, make sure the creek water didn't do any lasting damage." He moved around her with professional efficiency, checking her eyes with a light she couldn't see, listening to her lungs, and then he went very still, so still that Nora could feel the weight of his attention shifting from medical to something else entirely. "My God," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Thomas and Margot's daughter. Nora's breath caught because no one had spoken her parents' names in 5 years, not since the funeral, not since she'd been released from the hospital with bandaged eyes and a future that had burned to ash along with everything else. "You knew my parents?" "I knew them well," Jonah said carefully, and she could hear the weight of things unsaid in those words, secrets pressing against his throat. "Your mother, she was special, extraordinary, really." He paused, and Nora heard the door open again, felt that presence, the man from the creek filling the space with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Special how? The man's voice, still commanding but with an edge now, something protective or possessive, Nora couldn't tell which. Jonah exhaled slowly, the sound of a man stepping off a cliff. "Nora, has anyone ever told you what your parents were?" The question made no sense. What they were, as if her parents had been something other than people, other than the loving, ordinary couple she remembered from her childhood. "I don't understand." "They were wolves," Jonah said simply. "Werewolves, which means you are too." The silence that followed was so complete that Nora could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the fabric of her wet clothes rustling with each breath, could hear the man behind her shift his weight, waiting for her reaction. She laughed, because what else could she do? The sound harsh and disbelieving. "That's insane. Werewolves aren't real. They're mythology, children's stories." "You felt it," the man interrupted, moving closer. And Nora tensed, because he was right. She had felt something, that impossible electric connection when he touched her shoulder. "When I touched you, you know something happened." She wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. Because yes, she'd felt it, felt something fundamental shift in her chest, in her bones, in the parts of her that had no name or rational explanation. "What was that?" she asked instead, hating how small her voice sounded. "A mate bond," Jonah answered, when the man stayed silent.
It's rare, extremely rare. One pairing in 10,000, a biological and spiritual recognition between two compatible souls. He moved closer. She could feel him studying her with that physician's intensity. You're his true mate, and he's yours. The implications crashed over her like a wave. Mate, belonging to someone, being claimed by this stranger whose name she didn't even know. And panic started to build in her chest because she'd spent 5 years learning to be independent, learning to need no one. And now they were telling her that she was cosmically tied to a man she'd met 30 minutes ago. I can't, this isn't. I won't force anything. The man's voice, closer now, close enough that she could feel his breath disturb the air near her face. The bond is real, and it's not going away, but what we do about it is still your choice. I'm not going to take that from you. Something in his tone, the careful control that suggested he wanted to do exactly that, wanted to claim and keep and possess, but was holding himself back through sheer force of will, made Denora believe him in a way that terrified her. She should have demanded to leave, to be taken back to the cottage, to Mrs. Aldwych and the life she understood, even if she hated it. But before she could speak, a small voice interrupted from the doorway. "Is the nice lady staying?" Phoenix, the boy she'd pulled from the creek, and despite everything, despite the impossibility and fear and confusion, Nora felt herself soften at the sound of his voice. "Hello, sweetheart. You smell like honey and summer," Phoenix said, matter of fact, in the way of small children. "It's nice. The bad dreams are quieter when you're here." The man made a sound, something between pain and surprise, and Nora heard him move toward his son. "Phoenix, let her rest." "What bad dreams?" Nora interrupted, because she knew about nightmares, had lived with them for 5 years, and something in Phoenix's voice suggested a pain that went deeper than a 3-year-old should be capable of carrying. "Mama's gone," Phoenix said simply. "Sometimes I forget, and then I remember, and it hurts, and I dream about the hurting." He paused, then added, "But you make it quieter, like Mama used to." The silence that followed was heavy with grief, old and unhealed, and Nora understood suddenly that this man, this Alpha King, because she'd heard someone use that title in the hallways, was drowning just as surely as his son had been, just in slower motion, in loss instead of water. Without thinking, operating purely on instinct, she held out her hand. "Come here." Phoenix crossed to her immediately, climbed into her lap with the easy trust of children who hadn't yet learned to fear strangers, and Nora wrapped her arms around him, this small person who smelled like river water and something else, something wild that her logical mind said couldn't exist. He relaxed against her, his breathing evening out, and Nora found herself rocking slightly, humming something her mother used to hum, melody without words, comfort without explanation. When Jonah spoke again, his voice was quieter, meant for the man rather than her. "Everett, we need to talk, privately." Everett, finally, a name to attach to the presence that kept pulling at her awareness like gravity. She heard them move to the far side of the room, heard the murmur of voices too low to make out words, but she caught fragments, accelerants, magical residue, systematic destruction, murdered. Her parents hadn't died in an accident. Someone had killed them, deliberately, with magic that shouldn't exist, according to the world she thought she understood. "Why would I matter?" Nora heard herself ask, interrupting their conversation, because fear was turning to anger now, hot and bright. "I can't even. I've never shifted. I can't be what you're saying I am." "The fire," Jonah said, returning to her side. "What do you remember about it?" Nora closed her eyes, pointless gesture, and let herself fall back into that night 5 years ago. Heat, screaming, my mother shouting at me to run, and then pain, like my eyes were burning from the inside out, and something else, something that felt like hands reaching into my chest and taking something, locking it away where I couldn't reach it. "A binding spell," Jonah said grimly. Someone didn't just want your bloodline dead, they wanted you specifically neutralized, crippled, so you could never become a threat. He paused, and she could feel his anger matching her own. Your mother was a rare omega of powerful bloodline. The Whitlock line could produce alpha children from omega pairings. And they had another gift, the ability to sense deception, to read truth in people. Your wolf, once awakened, will know lies from honesty. Understanding hit her like a fist to the stomach. That's why they blinded me and bound my wolf. I'm a threat because I could expose them. Yes, Everett said, his voice carrying a fury that made the air feel heavier. And whoever did this is still out there. The first week passed in a blur of impossible revelations and reluctant acceptance, each day stripping away another layer of the world Nora thought she understood, until she was left standing on foundations she didn't recognize, in a life that felt simultaneously more real and more impossible than anything she'd experienced in the 5 years since the fire. Mrs. Aldwych had been moved to the PAC's medical facility, transferred with a gentleness that spoke of resources far beyond what a small-town hospice could provide. And while Nora knew the old woman was still dying, still losing her battle with a heart that had simply worn out,
at least now she was comfortable, free from pain, surrounded by people who could ease her final days in ways Nora never could have managed alone. The compound itself was a maze that Nora learned through patient repetition, guided initially by a young wolf named Cole, who had the particular kindness of someone who understood what it meant to be different, to exist on the margins of normal. He walked her through the main building, narrating each turn with careful detail. 47 steps from the main entrance to the corridor that led to the guest wing. Take a left at the place where the floor changes from wood to stone. You can feel it under your feet. 63 steps down this hall, and your room is the 4th door on the right. Handle sits at 42 inches, standard height. But the mapping wasn't the strangest part, wasn't the thing that kept Nora awake at night in the too soft bed in the too quiet room. The strangest part was that her senses were changing, evolving, in ways that had nothing to do with memory or practice. She could smell emotions now, actually smell them. Fear like copper, and stress like burnt coffee, and contentment like warm bread. Each person she passed trailing invisible clouds of feeling that her nose interpreted with increasing accuracy. She mentioned it to Jonah on the 3rd day, half convinced she was losing her mind, and he'd smiled, she could hear it in his voice, and explained that her wolf was waking up, that proximity to other wolves, and particularly to her mate, was activating abilities that had been dormant, suppressed by the binding spell that was beginning to crack under the pressure of what she was always meant to be. Everett was everywhere and nowhere, a presence she could feel even when he wasn't in the room. The mate bond that Jonah had described, humming between them like a live wire, transmitting emotions she had no right to feel. His worry, his desire, his iron-willed control that kept him from approaching her too directly, too demandingly. She'd see him, or rather sense him, standing at the end of hallways, watching from doorways. And the few times they'd been forced into direct conversation, the air between them had felt thick enough to choke on, charged with want and confusion, and the biological imperative that said they belonged to each other, even though her mind, her rational human mind, screamed that you couldn't belong to someone you barely knew. The 4th night, unable to sleep, Nora found her way to the kitchen through careful counting and the scent of coffee that someone had left brewing. She was standing at the counter, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, when she felt him enter, that shift in atmosphere that announced Everett before he spoke. "Can't sleep either?" His voice was quieter at night, less commanding, more human. "Too much quiet," Nora said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that every time she closed her eyes, she felt that electric shock of their first touch, felt her body reaching for his across the space that separated their rooms, and it terrified her how much she wanted to stop fighting it, to just give in and let the bond pull her wherever it wanted to go. She heard him move closer, pour his own coffee, and for a long moment they stood in silence,
two people who were supposed to be inevitable learning how to exist in the same space without combusting. "Tell me about your wife," Nora said finally, because she needed to understand, needed to know if he'd loved her, if this mate bond was a betrayal of something sacred or just biology trying to heal an old wound. Everett was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer, but then he exhaled, slow and controlled. "Eleanor." She was kind, strong. "We weren't true mates, but we had respect, partnership. She gave me Phoenix, and I'll always honor her for that." "But you loved her?" Nora pressed, needing to hear it. "I honored her," Everett corrected carefully. "It's different. I cared for her deeply, would have protected her with my life, but it wasn't what this is." He paused, and Nora could smell his frustration, his struggle to articulate something that had no adequate words. "I never expected to find a true mate. After 30 years, I assumed I didn't have one. I'd made peace with that." "And now?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I can't breathe right when you're not nearby," Everett said bluntly. "Now I lie awake listening to your heartbeat 3 rooms away and fight the urge to go to you, to make sure you're safe, to just be near you. It's not rational."
It's not something I can control, and I know that's probably terrifying for you to hear. It was, but it was also honest in a way that made Nora's chest ache, because she felt it too, that pull, that need, and knowing he was fighting the same battle made her feel less insane, less alone. "Can I?" she started, then stopped, because the request was too intimate, too vulnerable. But he seemed to understand anyway. "Yes," he said simply. Nora set down her mug and reached out, her hands finding his chest first, feeling the solid warmth of him, the heartbeat that matched the rhythm she heard in her sleep. Slowly, giving him time to refuse, though she knew he wouldn't, she moved her hands up to his face, tracing the architecture of his features with her fingertips. Strong jaw, roughened with stubble, sharp cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once, the ridge of scar tissue along his left temple, and his lips, surprisingly soft, parting slightly under her touch. He stood perfectly still, but she could feel him shaking, could smell the want rolling off him like heat, and when her fingers trailed down his neck, feeling his pulse jumping against her palm, he made a sound low in his throat that was more animal than human. His hand came up, covering hers, pressing it more firmly against his skin, and the mate bond surged, that electric connection amplifying until Nora gasped, her knees going weak with the force of it. They broke apart simultaneously, both breathing hard, and Nora's whole body was singing with need, with the desire to close the distance again, to finish what they'd started. "You should rest," Everett said, his voice wrecked, barely controlled. "Yes," Nora agreed, but neither of them moved for a long moment, caught in the gravity of what they were to each other, what they could be if they stopped fighting and just let themselves fall. Phoenix found her the next morning, his small voice announcing his presence before his footsteps did. "Can you read to me? Papa's in meetings and everyone else is busy." He'd been following her around since the first day, this small shadow who seemed to have decided that Nora was safe, was comfort, was something he needed in ways he couldn't articulate. Jonah had found Braille books somewhere, an entire shelf of them, and Nora sat with Phoenix curled against her side, her fingers moving over the raised dots while she translated the story aloud. Some fairy tale about princes and dragons and happy endings that felt impossibly distant from her own reality. Phoenix interrupted frequently with questions, his child's logic finding holes in the narrative that made Nora smile despite everything. "Why don't your eyes work?" he asked suddenly, with the blunt curiosity of someone too young to know the question was rude. "There was a fire," Nora explained simply. "It hurt them, so they don't see anymore." "Did it hurt a lot?" "Yes, but I'm okay now." Phoenix was quiet for a moment, then said with devastating insight, "Papa's eyes hurt too, but different. Inside hurt, not outside hurt." Nora's throat tightened.
Because Phoenix was right. She could feel Everett's grief through the bond, old and unhealed, and she understood suddenly that she wasn't just Phoenix's comfort. She was Everett's too. The first thing in 3 years that had made him feel something other than duty and loss. The emergency council session was called on the 9th day, and Nora knew from the tension crackling through the compound that this wasn't routine business. This was about her, about the blind Omega who'd appeared from nowhere and somehow become essential to the Alpha King's household in just over a week. Everett had tried to shield her from it, had argued that she wasn't ready, that forcing her to face the council's scrutiny was premature and cruel. But Meredith Voss, High Counselor and the woman Nora had known as Miss Voss, had invoked protocols that even an Alpha King couldn't dismiss without undermining his own authority. They dressed Nora carefully, Tessa helping her into formal clothes that felt wrong against her skin, too structured, too representative of a role she didn't understand how to fill. "You'll be fine," Tessa said, but Nora could smell the lie underneath the reassurance, could sense the older woman's worry like smoke in the air. "Just answer their questions honestly. Don't let them intimidate you." The council chamber was vast. Nora could tell from the way sound echoed, from the number of heartbeats it filled the space. At least 40 people, maybe more. All of them watching her, measuring her, finding her wanting before she'd even opened her mouth. Everett wasn't allowed inside, conflict of interest, and his absence felt like losing a limb, the mate bond stretching thin and anxious across the distance that separated them. Meredith's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, cold and precise. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We're here to discuss the irregular situation regarding Nora Whitlock, an unmated Omega of unknown origin who has been residing in the Alpha King's personal quarters for over a week without proper vetting or council approval." The words were chosen to make Nora sound like a threat, like something dangerous that had infiltrated their territory. And she forced herself to breathe evenly, to not show the fear that was coiling in her stomach. "I saved a child from drowning," she said clearly. "Is it?" Meredith's voice moved closer, circling like a predator. "You, a blind woman who's lived isolated for 5 years, just happened to be at the exact location where the Alpha King's heir fell into the creek? You don't find that timing remarkably convenient?" Nora's hands clenched in her lap. "Are you suggesting I somehow caused a 3-year-old to nearly drown so I could engineer a meeting with his father? That's insane." "Is it?" Meredith repeated. "We have only your word about what happened. Perhaps you were already in the water. Perhaps you pushed him in, then played the hero. It wouldn't be the first time someone used a child as a pawn to gain access to power." The accusations were so outrageous that Nora almost laughed, but the silence in the chamber suggested others were considering the possibility, were looking at her and seeing not a victim who'd survived tragedy, but a manipulator who'd orchestrated one. Dr. Cartwright examined Phoenix immediately. There were no signs of violence, no indication of anything, except a child who wandered too far and fell into water. Dr. Cartwright, who coincidentally knew your parents, Meredith said smoothly, who has clear bias toward you. His testimony is hardly objective. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then continued. And then there's the matter of the sedative herbs found in Phoenix's system 3 days ago. Someone drugged the Alpha King's heir. Someone with access to the compound, to his food, to his room. Someone like a live-in guest who's been here for over a week. Nora's blood went cold because the accusation was shifting from suspicious timing to outright attempted harm, and she had no defense, no way to prove she hadn't been near Phoenix's food, hadn't had opportunity to drug him. "I would never hurt a child, anyone who knows me." "But we don't know you," Meredith interrupted. "That's the problem. You appear from nowhere with a tragic backstory and convenient blindness that makes you seem helpless, and within days you've inserted yourself into the Alpha King's life, into his son's life, And now we have a drugging incident that could easily have resulted in Phoenix's death if he'd wandered into more dangerous territory. The room was turning against her. Nora could feel it, the mood shifting from skepticism to active hostility. And she understood suddenly that this had been planned, orchestrated, that Meredith had been building this narrative carefully, waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. "You drugged him," Nora said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You did it to frame me, to give yourself justification for removing me from the compound." The silence that followed was absolute. And then Meredith laughed, a cold sound that held no humor. That's a serious accusation without proof. Dr. Cartwright found the sedative, yes, but anyone could have administered it. Even someone desperate to create a situation where she could play protector again, could prove her value to a grieving Alpha King looking for someone to trust. Nora opened her mouth to respond, but hands were already gripping her arms, guards following Meredith's unspoken command. And she felt something at her collarbone, the wire she'd been wearing, the recording device that Jonah had insisted she carried. They ripped it free, not gently, and Meredith's voice was satisfied when she spoke again. Wearing a wire to council proceedings? That's grounds for imprisonment, for assuming the council acts in bad faith. She moved closer, close enough that Nora could smell her, could sense underneath the perfume something darker, guilt and fear and buried rage. "You stupid girl. Did you really think your blind fumbling would expose?"
"Anything. Take her to holding. She'll await judgment there." Nora tried to pull free, but the guards were stronger, were dragging her toward the doors, and she could feel Everett through the bond, his rage and fear and the building pressure that meant he was losing control. "You're afraid," Nora said, loud enough for the chamber to hear. "I can smell it on you. You're terrified of what I might reveal because you're guilty. You killed my parents. You've been eliminating Omegas for years, and you're afraid that if I shift, if my wolf wakes up, I'll be able to prove it." Meredith's mask slipped for just a second, fury flashing across her face before she controlled it. "Remove her, now." The holding cells were underground, carved from stone and reinforced with wards that Nora could feel pressing against her skin like static electricity, magic designed to suppress supernatural abilities, to keep wolves contained. They threw her into the cell without ceremony, the door slamming with a finality that echoed through her bones, and then she was alone in a darkness that was somehow worse than the darkness she lived in every day, because this darkness was a cage, was a tomb, was the place where she was going to die, because Meredith would never let her leave here alive. She felt along the walls, counting steps, because numbers were still reliable, still something she could control when everything else was chaos. 12 feet by 8 feet, stone walls, damp floor, the sound of water dripping somewhere distant, and rats. She could hear them skittering in the corners, small heartbeats that were somehow more terrifying than large ones, because rats meant forgotten places, meant spaces where people were left to rot. The speaker crackled to life, Meredith's voice filling the cell. "You should have stayed hidden, Nora, blind and ignorant in that cottage, serving your pathetic old woman until she died, and you followed shortly after. That was the plan, you know. Let you live out your meaningless life thinking you were safe, thinking the fire was just bad luck." Nora pressed her back against the wall, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Why? Why murder all those people? What did my parents do to you?" Meredith was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was something raw in her voice, old pain that had festered into madness. "Your parents did nothing, but 40 years ago, Everett's father chose another woman over me, chose her because she was beautiful, because she was young, because I was just the counselor's daughter, and she was the visiting alpha's sister. I've spent 4 decades building power, consolidating control, eliminating anyone who might threaten my position." "You wanted Everett," Nora said, understanding clicking into place. "I want what should have been mine from the beginning, the Alpha King's mate, the respect, the authority.
Every powerful Omega was a threat to that plan. Every woman who might catch his attention had to be removed. And you, with your precious bloodline and your tragic story, you were the worst threat of all, because he didn't just want you, he bonded to you. And bonds like that can't be easily broken. You'll never have him, Nora said. The bond. Bonds can be severed, Meredith interrupted. You just need the right spell. And once you're dead, once he grieves and moves past it, he'll see reason. He'll see that he needs someone strong beside him, someone who can actually lead, not some blind girl playing at being Luna. The speaker clicked off, and Nora heard the cell door opening, heard Meredith's footsteps descending the stairs, slow and deliberate. Meredith entered the cell alone, which was her first mistake, and Nora could smell the confidence radiating off her like perfume, the certainty of someone who believed they'd already won. "I'm going to kill you myself," Meredith said, conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than murder. "Make it look like suicide, a mentally unstable blind woman who couldn't handle the pressure of council scrutiny. Everett will mourn, of course, but he'll move on. They always do." Nora pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, because she had no weapons, no sight, no way to defend herself against a trained warrior who could see every move before Nora made it. But she'd survived 5 years in darkness, had learned to navigate a world that didn't accommodate her disability. And if she was going to die, she was going to die fighting, not cowering. Meredith moved fast. Nora heard the rush of air and threw herself sideways, felt the impact of body hitting stone where she'd been standing a second before. She scrambled, hands reaching for anything, found a loose rock and threw it toward where she'd heard Meredith curse. Didn't wait to see if it connected, just moved, counting steps, using the echoes to map the space. 12 by 8, walls on all sides, only one exit, and Meredith was between her and freedom. "You can't run forever," Meredith said, and Nora could hear the smile in her voice, the enjoyment of the hunt. "This just makes it more interesting. I was going to make it quick, but now I think I'll take my time, make you understand exactly how powerless you really are." The first blow caught Nora across the face, snapping her head back and filling her mouth with blood, and she staggered, nearly went down, but staying down meant death, so she pushed forward, swung blindly and felt her fist connect with something solid, heard Meredith's grunt of surprise. It wasn't enough, wasn't nearly enough, because Meredith was stronger, faster, trained in combat, and Nora was just a blind girl who'd learned self-defense from library books she'd had read aloud to her. The beating was systematic, professional, each strike calculated to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly, and Nora felt ribs crack, felt her left arm go numb from a blow to the shoulder, tasted blood and fear and the bitter certainty that this was how it ended, in darkness and pain and alone. Meredith's voice came from somewhere above her. Nora was on the ground now, couldn't remember falling, and the words cut deeper than the physical blows. "Your parents begged, you know. Your mother cried for you before I burned her, called your name like you could somehow save her. She died knowing she'd failed to protect you, died watching the fire take everything she loved." The words detonated something in Nora's chest. Not grief. Grief was too small a word for the rage that erupted through her bloodstream like molten metal. And she felt it, the thing that Jonah had said was locked inside her, the wolf that had been caged and suppressed and bound with magic that was cracking, splintering, shattering under the pressure of fury and desperation and the biological imperative to survive. The shift was agony, worse than the fire, worse than anything Nora had experienced, because her body wasn't meant to do this, wasn't prepared, was fighting itself as bones broke and reformed, as her spine elongated and her face pushed forward into a muzzle, as fur erupted through skin that felt like it was tearing apart. She screamed, but the sound came out as a howl, high and anguished and full of 5 years of suppressed pain. And then she wasn't human anymore, was something else, something with 4 legs and teeth and senses that made her blindness almost irrelevant, because she could smell Meredith's location, could hear her heartbeat, could sense the heat of her body like a beacon in the darkness. Nora lunged, all instinct and rage, and felt her teeth sink into flesh, tasted blood, heard Meredith scream of shock and pain. But Meredith was shifting too, her body contorting into something larger, more experienced, a silver wolf that dwarfed Nora's honey-gold form. And the brief advantage of surprise vanished as Meredith's jaws closed around Nora's throat, not killing, not yet, just asserting dominance, demonstrating the difference between a wolf who'd shifted for the first time and one who'd been doing it for 40 years. Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the pressure on her windpipe and the certainty that in seconds it would close completely and everything would be over. The mate bond was screaming, Everett's terror and rage flooding through the connection, and she tried to send something back, tried to tell her she was sorry, that she'd tried, that she wished they'd had more time. But then the pressure vanished, and she was gasping, choking on air, and she heard it, the sound that meant salvation or damnation, depending on which side you were on. Everett, in wolf form, was the size of a small bear, his auburn fur bristling with fury. And the sound he made wasn't a howl or a growl, but something deeper, something that resonated in the bones and made Nora's instinct scream to submit, to roll over and show belly, because nothing defied that sound and survived. Meredith released Nora and tried to run, but there was nowhere to run. The cell was too small, and Everett was on her before she'd made it 3 steps, his jaws closing around her neck with the finality of an execution. The fight was brutal and one-sided.
Dead. Meredith was skilled, but Everett was the alpha king for a reason, was power incarnate, and within seconds it was over. Meredith's silver wolf lying still, throat torn open, blood pooling on the stone floor. Everett shifted back to human form, naked and covered in blood, and his eyes found Nora's wolf form, golden and amber, meeting in a moment that held everything they'd never said aloud. "Shift back," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nora, you need to shift back." But Nora didn't know how, didn't understand how to reverse what had happened, was trapped in this form with senses that were overwhelming and a body that didn't feel like hers. And panic was building again, because what if she was stuck? What if her first shift was also her last? What if she'd saved herself only to lose herself in the process? Everett moved slowly, careful not to spook her, and knelt beside her wolf form, his hands gentle in her fur. "Listen to my voice. Feel the bond. Use it as an anchor. Your human form is still there. You just need to reach for it." She tried, focused on his voice, on the mate bond that connected them, on the memory of human hands and human speech, and the life she'd lived for 24 years before tonight. And slowly, painfully, she felt herself shifting back, bones realigning, fur receding, until she was human again, naked and shaking, and covered in blood that was both hers and Meredith's. Everett wrapped her in his arms, didn't seem to care about the blood or the nakedness or any of it, just held her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. And Nora buried her face against his chest and let herself break, let herself cry for her parents and for the 5 years she'd lost, and for the terror of almost dying, and the relief of being alive. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe. I'm here." But safe was relative, because Meredith was dead at their feet, and the conspiracy she'd mentioned was larger than just one woman. And somewhere above them, the compound was in chaos. Jonah working to break the wards, pack members choosing sides, and the fragile peace that had existed before tonight was shattered beyond repair. Nora pulled back enough to speak, her voice raw from screaming and shifting. She said bonds could be severed. She was going to kill me and make you forget. Everett's arms tightened around her. "No magic in existence could make me forget you. Even if the bond broke, even if every memory was stripped away, I would know you. My soul would know you." He pressed his forehead to hers,
his voice dropping to something that was barely more than breath. "I love you. I should have said it before, should have told you every day since you pulled Phoenix from that creek, but I'm saying it now. I love you." The words settled into Nora's chest like something she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. And despite everything, despite the blood and death and trauma, she smiled. "I love you too. Even though you're bossy and overprotective and you have terrible timing." He laughed, the sound broken but genuine, and kissed her, gentle and reverent, like she was something holy rather than something covered in gore and shaking with aftershocks. Nora drifted in darkness for 4 days, her body locked in wolf form that wouldn't release her, her consciousness fragmenting between human thought and animal instinct until she couldn't remember which one she was supposed to be. She was aware, distantly, of Everett's presence, his hand in her fur, his voice reading to her, the way she'd read to Phoenix, trying to anchor her to humanity through stories and desperate love. She was aware of Phoenix curling against her wolf body at night, small and warm and trusting, whispering that she needed to wake up because he missed her voice. She was aware of Jonah's examinations, his worried murmurs to Everett about trauma and first shifts, and the possibility that her mind had retreated so far into the wolf that it might never find its way back. Inside the fractured space of her consciousness, Nora walked through memories that weren't linear, weren't organized, just fragments of a life she'd lived and a life she'd lost. She saw her mother's face, beautiful and fierce, teaching a 10-year-old Nora how to sense lies by listening to heartbeats, by reading the chemical signatures of stress and deception. She saw her father arguing with council members, his voice raised in righteous anger about power consolidation and the erosion of pack democracy. She saw Meredith's face in the shadows the day before the fire, watching their house with an expression that Nora's child self hadn't understood, but her current self recognized as murderous intent. And then she was in the fire again, reliving the worst night of her life with clarity that her traumatized 16-year-old mind had mercifully suppressed. Her mother shoving her toward the window, screaming at her to run, to find the Grayson pack, to survive. The silver flames that weren't natural fire but magic, eating through wood and flesh with equal hunger. The moment when Meredith's spell hit her, not meant to kill but to cripple, burning away her sight and locking her wolf in a cage of magic that was supposed to keep her powerless forever. Her mother's last act, throwing herself between Nora and the killing blow, buying her daughter seconds to escape through the window into darkness and a future that had seemed like no future at all. But she'd survived, had spent 5 years learning to navigate blindness, learning to be strong in ways she'd never needed when she could see. And that strength was what finally pulled her back. The understanding that she wasn't broken, wasn't helpless, wasn't the victim that Meredith had tried to make her. She was Nora Whitlock, daughter of murdered parents, survivor of magical assassination, and mate to the Alpha King. And it was time to stop hiding in the safety of unconsciousness and face the world that was waiting for her. The shift back to human was easier this time, her body remembering the path even if her mind had been lost. And she woke in the medical bay with Everett's head pillowed on the bed beside her, his hand still tangled in her hair. He was asleep, exhausted in a way that spoke of days without rest. And Nora took a moment to just look at him, or rather to sense him. His face relaxed in sleep, the lines of stress temporarily smoothed away. And her heart ached with the depth of what she felt for this man who'd stayed beside her through 4 days of uncertainty, who'd refused to give up even when Jonah had gently suggested he prepare for the worst. "I heard you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Every word, every story. I heard you." Everett's eyes snapped open, gold flooding the amber as he registered that she was awake, was human, was back. And then he was pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could. "Don't ever do that to me again. Don't ever leave me like that. I can't survive losing you." "You won't," Nora said, and she meant it. could feel through the mate bond that they were tangled together too deeply now for death to truly separate them. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Phoenix's arrival was announced by running footsteps and an excited shout, and then he was climbing onto the bed, wrapping his small arms around Nora's neck with the fierce affection of a 3-year-old who'd been scared and was now relieved. "You're awake! You're you again! Papa said you were sleeping, but I knew you'd come back because you promised to teach me numbers." Nora laughed, the sound ending in something close to a sob, and held Phoenix close while Everett held them both, a family that had formed in the space of 2 weeks through trauma and magic and love that defied every rational explanation. The compound was in chaos when Nora was finally strong enough to leave the medical bay, the power structure fractured by Meredith's death and the revelations that had followed. Jonah had searched her quarters, had found correspondence with 2 other council members, Paige and Thorne, detailing their conspiracy to eliminate powerful Omegas and consolidate authority under a council that answered to no one. Evidence of 7 murders over 5 years, careful documentation of spells and accelerants and cover-ups, all preserved because Meredith had been arrogant enough to believe she was untouchable. Paige had fled the territory the day after Meredith's death, had taken her mate and children, and disappeared into human society, where pack law couldn't reach her. Thorne had surrendered, had thrown himself on Everett's mercy, and confessed everything in exchange for a life sentence rather than execution. And his testimony had filled in the gaps, had painted a picture of systematic evil that made Nora's stomach turn. The council meeting that followed was nothing like the one that had sent Nora to the cells. This time, she stood beside Everett, not as prisoner, but as Luna designate, and the remaining council members looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. She couldn't tell which, and didn't particularly care. She'd proven herself through survival, through strength that didn't require sight, and anyone who couldn't accept that was welcome to leave. "The old ways are done," Everett said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha king who'd been pushed too far and was done being patient. No more shadow councils making decisions without accountability. No more targeting wolves because their bloodline threatens someone's political ambitions. We're going to rebuild this pack based on merit and loyalty, not fear and manipulation. There was resistance. There was always resistance to change, but it was muted, hesitant, because no one wanted to be the next example after Meredith and Thorne. Nora stood silent through most of it, her hand in Everett's, feeling through her awakened senses the currents of emotion in the room, the fear and anger and cautious hope, and she knew this was just the beginning, that rebuilding would take months or years, but at least now they were moving in the right direction. The challenge came from Marcus Hale 3 days later, a traditionalist beta who believed that a Luna should be support rather than equal, who looked at Nora's blindness and saw weakness rather than adapted strength. If she wants authority, let her prove it, trial by combat. If she can't defend herself, she has no business leading others. Nora could have refused. The challenge wasn't technically valid without Everett's permission, but she didn't want to hide behind her mate's authority, didn't want to be seen as something that needed protecting rather than someone capable of protecting others. "I accept. Name your champion." Marcus smiled, confident and condescending. "I am champion." The combat ring was packed with spectators, the entire pack it seemed, all of them curious to see if the blind Omega could actually fight, or if this would be a massacre. Nora shifted to wolf form, honey gold and smaller than Marcus's brown wolf, but faster, more desperate, and she had advantages he didn't, advantages that came from living in darkness for 5 years and learning to read the world through senses he took for granted. He fought conventionally, relied on feints and visual tricks, attacking from angles that should have left her confused and vulnerable. But Nora didn't see his fake-outs, didn't see the movements meant to deceive. She felt his intentions through scent and air displacement, and the particular sound of weight shifting before a strike. And she responded to what he was actually doing, rather than what he wanted her to think he was doing. The tide turned slowly, her speed and precision wearing him down, And when she finally had him pinned, her jaws at his throat, she could have killed him, could have made an example, but she shifted back to human instead, stood over him while he remained wolf, vulnerable and defeated. "I don't need to kill you. I just need you to yield." Marcus shifted back, his expression caught between humiliation and reluctant respect. "I yield, Luna." The pack's howling approval rolled over her like a wave, acceptance earned rather than given. And Nora felt something settle in her chest, the beginning of belonging, of home. That night, in Everett's chambers, they completed the mate bond through ancient ritual and physical union that Nora had been too afraid to accept before, too uncertain of her place and her worth. But she wasn't uncertain anymore, wasn't afraid. And when the mating mark appeared over her heart, a silver wolf print that glowed faintly in darkness she couldn't see, she felt complete for the first time since the fire had stolen half her world. 3 months after Meredith's death, the compound had transformed from a place of suspicion and political maneuvering into something that felt, for the first time in years, according to the older pack members, like an actual community. Nora had implemented changes that seemed small on the surface, but resonated deeply through the pack structure. A support system for wolves with disabilities who'd previously been cast out or hidden away in shame. Training programs that emphasized adaptation rather than limitation. Council seats awarded based on merit and service rather than bloodline and political connections. There was still resistance. There would always be resistance to change. But it was the grumbling of people adjusting to new expectations rather than the hostility of those protecting unjust power. Mrs. Aldwych had passed quietly in her sleep 6 weeks after Nora had left the cottage, surrounded by pack healers who'd made her final days as comfortable as modern medicine and ancient as magic could manage. Nora had been there at the end, holding the old woman's hand while she drifted away, and Mrs. Aldwich's last words had been, "You found your place, child. I'm so glad you found your place." The funeral had been small, human ceremony rather than pack ritual, but Everett had stood beside Nora through all of it, solid and supportive, and she'd understood that this pack, this family she'd stumbled into, honored all losses, regardless of species or status. Nora had visited her parents' memorial the previous week, the plot of land in pack territory where Jonah had erected a marker for Thomas and Margot Whitlock, murdered for their bloodline and their principles. She'd knelt in the grass, her fingers tracing the carved letters she couldn't see, and talked to them the way she used to when she was small and thought parents knew everything, could fix anything. "I found the Grayson pack like you said, Mama. I understand now why you told me to run here, why you trusted them even when you knew you were dying. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm Luna. I'm mated, and I'm going to be a mother." That last part was still new enough that saying it aloud felt surreal, but her body had been changing for weeks, subtle shifts that her supernatural senses picked up before any human pregnancy test could confirm, and she'd known, had felt the second heartbeat nestling into existence beneath her own. Everett had found her there at the memorial, had simply sat beside her in the grass and let her have her grief and her joy and the complicated tangle of both. "They would be proud of you," he'd said eventually, "of who you've become, of the Luna you are." "I hope so," Nora had whispered. "I hope they'd think I honored them. You survived. You thrived. You refused to let the people who killed them define you. That's the greatest honor you could give them." The official Luna crowning ceremony was held on the first day of spring, 3 months after her arrival, and Nora wore the crown that she'd helped design through touch, silver worked into a pattern that represented strength through adversity, beauty in adaptation, power that didn't require sight to be effective. The pack gathered, hundreds of wolves in human and animal form, and she felt their attention like weight against her skin, expectation and hope, and the willingness to follow if she proved worth following. Her speech was short. She'd never been comfortable with lengthy proclamations, but she poured everything she'd learned into those few minutes. "I came here blind, broken, barely surviving. You could have rejected me, could have seen only my limitations, and decided I wasn't worth the effort. Instead, you saw what I couldn't see in myself, strength I didn't know I had, potential I'd given up on finding. I promised to lead with truth, to protect with everything I have, to love this pack the way you've loved me, without condition, without hesitation, without limits. She paused, feeling the weight of the moment, the shift from Nora Whitlock the survivor to Nora Grayson the Luna. We are pack, we are family, and we are unbreakable. The howling that followed was deafening, approval and acceptance, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be commanded, only earned. And Nora felt tears sliding down her face because she'd been so alone for so long. And now she was surrounded by people who chose her, who wanted her, who saw her as essential rather than burden. Phoenix's perspective on everything had the clarity that only children possessed, uncomplicated by adult concerns about politics or propriety. He'd told Tessa, who'd told Nora later with barely suppressed laughter, that before Nora, Papa was sad and the house was quiet and everything was gray. Now it's loud and warm and full of colors I can't even name. Nora says being different is good, and I'm different too, because I'm Prince, but also just Phoenix. And that's okay, because different doesn't mean wrong. The fact that a 3-year-old understood concepts that many adults still struggled with gave Nora hope that the next generation would be better, kinder, more accepting than the one that had tried to destroy her. The pregnancy announcement came during a small family dinner, just Nora and Everett and Phoenix and Jonah, because she'd wanted the people who mattered most to know before it became pack business. I'm pregnant, she'd said simply, watching through her supernatural senses as Everett went completely still, as joy and terror and overwhelming protectiveness crashed through him in waves, strong enough that she felt them through the mate bond.
Are certain? He'd asked, his voice careful, controlled, like he was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. I can sense 2 heartbeats in my body, I'm certain. She'd reached for his hand, guided it to her still flat stomach. Our child, our family. Phoenix had been thrilled, had immediately started planning all the things he would teach his younger sibling, and his excitement had broken the tension, had let them all celebrate without the weight of what this meant politically, the first child born to true mates in the Grayson line in over a century, an heir that would be more powerful than any alpha in living memory. They'd visited Eleanor's grave together a week later, Everett needing closure that he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Nora had stood beside him while he spoke to his first wife, thanking her for Phoenix, apologizing for moving on, explaining that he'd found his true mate and hoped she understood. Nora had added her own words, promising to honor Eleanor's memory by loving her son, by being the mother Phoenix needed, even though she could never replace the one he'd lost. It had felt right, necessary, a bridge between past and future that let them all move forward without guilt. The final scene, the one that would stay with Nora for the rest of her life, happened on a morning 6 months after the Luna ceremony, when pregnancy had become visible, undeniable, a reality that would arrive in 3 more months. They'd return to the creek, the place where everything had started, where a blind woman had pulled a drowning child from water and changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Phoenix splashed in the shallows under careful supervision, his laughter bright and uninhibited, and Nora stood at the bank with Everett's arms around her from behind, his hands resting on the swell of their child. "This is where it started," she said, echoing words from months ago. "No," Everett corrected gently. "This is where it continues, where we continue." They shifted together, Nora's honey gold wolf, and Everett's massive auburn form, and Phoenix's small russet body, and ran through the forest with the pack joining them, 50 wolves moving as one coordinated unit. Nora's senses painted the world in textures and temperatures and scents, in the rush of wind through fur and the pounding of earth beneath paws, and she understood that sight was only one way of perceiving, that she'd learned to see with her soul instead of her eyes,
and that vision was clearer, truer, more honest than anything her physical sight had ever shown her. She couldn't see the sunrise that was painting the sky in colors Everett described to her later, gold like her fur, and pink like Phoenix's laughter, and blue like freedom. But she didn't need to see it, to feel it, to know it, to understand that she was exactly where she belonged. She was Luna of the Northwestern Territories, mother to Phoenix and the child growing beneath her heart, mate to Everett, protector of wolves who'd been cast aside for being different. But most importantly, she was Nora, no longer defined by what she'd lost, but by everything she'd found. There were different kinds of sight, she'd learned, and some people saw with eyes while others saw with hearts, with souls, with the parts of themselves that couldn't be measured or categorized or limited by physical ability. The fire had taken her sight, but couldn't take her vision. The darkness had isolated her, but couldn't dim the light she carried inside. And she'd survived not in spite of her blindness, but because of the strength it had forced her to develop. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd counted steps through Mrs. Aldwich's cottage, measuring existence in textures and temperatures because the world had become too frightening to navigate any other way. She was Luna, mother, mate, leader of wolves who'd learned that true strength came not from never falling, but from rising every time you were knocked down, from adapting rather than surrendering, from choosing to see possibility in darkness rather than letting the darkness define what was possible. And as she ran through the forest with her family, with her pack, with the future growing inside her, and the past finally at peace behind her, Nora understood that she could finally, truly see. Not with her eyes, but with something infinitely more powerful, the vision of someone who'd walked through fire and darkness and had emerged not broken, but reforged into something stronger than she'd ever been before. She was home, she was loved, she was free. And that was the clearest sight of all.